Welcome to Trial Site News Podcast Series. Today we are pleased to introduce Ed Seguine, CEO of Clinical Inc., and we will be talking about virtual or hybrid trials, bring your own device ePRO, and direct data capture, and how it can provide a valuable solution during a healthcare crisis like COVID-19. So Ed, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
The pleasure is ours. So how can hybrid trial implementations help during the current COVID-19 pandemic?
That's a very good question. So hybrid trials have a significant ability to help with existing patients. So in a clinical trial, you first have the activity of recruiting new patients. And once patients are recruited into the study, they have to continue with the regimen and schedule of the activities that they're supposed to complete. And when COVID-19 hit, we looked at all of our system analytics and saw that ultimately new patient enrollment, the number of new patients getting started in a study, dropped off precipitously, which then puts the criticality on maintaining the existing patients in the study. And that dropped off to about a 60% level from normal. And the advantage of a hybrid implementation would allow those patients who are already enrolled in the study the option of continuing to participate in the study from the safety of their own home. Because if they're making a decision, pretend they're in a dermatology study,
right?
They may not want to go to a healthcare site that is treating COVID patients just to get their dermatology condition looked at. And so having an option for them to continue to participate away from the traditional healthcare setting is important in being able to maintain the continuity of the study, because in many studies that continued participation, staying on your drug and seeing its effects, is critically important. And just giving the patients an option to be able to do that in a remote setting would help existing patients. I've heard some companies tout go all virtual, meaning no site visits. I think that's a little bit misleading, because getting a new patient enrolled in a study virtually is a very significant hurdle for them to have the confidence to participate without that trusted clinical provider interaction. So I'm less confident that hybrid studies or virtual studies are a substitute for that direct contact that patients may need to have the confidence to enroll in a study in the first place, but absolutely believe that they can be an option for helping to provide existing patients a way of maintaining continuity and maintaining the current course of the study.
Right. Not to mention that choice is a component you don't want to get rid of, and it would be, I think, a mistake to not provide your patients with that choice.
Yep, absolutely.
So can you explain to our audience how virtual trials would ease physicians' office burden during times of stress to the healthcare system, as is happening now during this pandemic?
Yeah, so one of the things that's underappreciated in a clinical trial is that the burden is actually twofold. You have on the office staff, you have the initial patient visit, and after that patient visit, what typically happens is the site has a secondary activity where they have to type the information gathered during that visit into a separate system, and subsequently third parties have to visit the site and review that data that was entered into the system to ensure that it was entered correctly and that the activities that were performed were those that they were supposed to. So an on-site visit actually creates a twofold burden. One, initially at the time of the visit for the patient, and secondarily for a third party to come back. And it's especially that activity of coming back and monitoring the events that have occurred that is particularly problematic, especially in a situation like COVID-19, where it's a highly infectious setting. Even the monitors don't want to come and review that in a setting like that. And we've had a lot of experience in other infectious disease areas where that exists. And so you want to make sure that the office staff is focused on treating those that need the greatest care. Even in an unrelated therapeutic area, like we use the example of dermatology. Well, you could have a dermatology-specific office, but there is, in an environment like this, even though there may not be COVID-19 patients being treated there, where there's travel restrictions and quarantines and things like that, you don't want to have the unnecessary traffic and unnecessary visits if you can get rid of those. And so being able to employ a virtual approach allows the site during that visit to document the interaction electronically in the first place. Mm-hmm. And so there's no secondary need to then reconfirm what data was entered, what activities were happening, because the original visit itself was documented electronically.
So DDC, could you explain to our audience why this particular type of trials makes sense for infectious disease studies?
Yeah, so DDC stands for direct data capture. And what this refers to is exactly what I was just saying previously, is that the initial moment of that patient visit, the data is recorded electronically. What a lot of people don't appreciate is that 90% of trials have at least some portion of their data captured on paper. And that capture on paper is what then requires a secondary step to enter it into an electronic database, requires the monitoring of that original paper observation to ensure that it is was done correctly. And so the regulatory agencies do in fact view the original observations as the single most important elements of the clinical trial. And so by capturing it on paper and then doing these subsequent activities, you necessitate additional steps to confirm that it was correct, as opposed to in a direct data capture setting where you're capturing it electronically in the first place. You have the ability to confirm that the data that you wrote down at that moment is in fact accurate, and it can be reviewed remotely. And that has a tremendous benefit to eliminating these secondary visits. The most extreme example that we've been a participant in is, first and foremost, we're actually involved in 2 COVID-19 studies right now that are being done in hospital settings where they've restricted the activity of monitors and third parties to come in and review the data that's being collected, review the procedures. And so our system allows them that same access to review the data because it's electronic in the first place. But where this really gained traction is several years ago when the world was dealing with Ebola outbreaks. That is certainly even a more serious and more infectious, and the consequences are even more dramatic condition. And we were involved in doing a 6,000 patient Ebola study in West Africa, where legitimately the dangers that would come from sending someone to an Ebola site to confirm that, yes, the study protocol was carried out correctly and the data was subsequently entered correctly. And not just that, but the lag time between when you saw a patient and you recorded the data in the systems can create days or weeks before you get the ability to access that data. And that leads to problems of, in fast changing conditions like Ebola or COVID, the patient's condition can change and their treatment approach, or maybe the adjustments that may need to be made in the protocol are not as visible. And so direct data capture happening at the time when they're assessing the patient, recording it electronically, allows the data to be available instantaneously for review, for assessment. The monitors who are confirming the activities can review it from wherever they are at, including having the involvement of experts to have an additional perspective on what's going on. And in the case of Ebola, they had the monitors reviewing data from Africa, and they were based in London and South Africa. And so it really is all about the safety of the execution of the trial while maintaining the integrity of the data collected in the first place and getting it in real time to enable decisions to be made about how to treat that patient on an ongoing basis, any adjustments that may need to be made. All are a function and a consequence of being able to have that data electronic in the first place.
Right. So how can hybrid studies reduce trial costs, improve data quality, as you were mentioning, and engage patients?
So hybrid designs are really about creating optionality. And that means that approach to conducting the study has the flexibility built into it to either conduct visits at the site or give a predefined set of options about those things that can be conducted outside of the site. And a virtual trial itself doesn't on its own reduce the cost. It can reduce the cost if there are approaches that are taken in terms of the technology being used to facilitate the hybrid study design. Direct data capture being one of those. Another option as a technology platform to enable patients to capture more of the data as part of their home experience while they're staying at home is ePRO data, where you're capturing electronic patient reported outcomes. What's the patient experience being? But traditionally, the industry has given patients a phone, like saying, here's your separate clinical trial phone. Go ahead and capture your clinical trial data experience on this phone. But in a pandemic environment like this, even the logistics of getting patients' phones or getting phones to the sites or through customs, if it's an international study and shipped overseas, can be a very, very difficult, problematic activity. Let alone then, in some cases, the study anticipates that you're sharing devices with other patients. Once they finish, you hand it off, which creates some infectious disease concerns. Being able to employ ePRO, do ePRO studies using a model where patients can download the application and run it off of their own phone, a model called Bring Your Own Device, BYOD. So in models where you have a technology platform, direct data capture, and BYOD ePRO, you can substantially drive the costs down, but more importantly, you're improving the data quality and the accessibility for patients, because you're much more likely to have your own phone with you at all times as opposed to carrying a second one around with you. And that eliminates the cost of shipping, logistics, the additional expense of getting phones into patients' hands. And as we just talked previously, the direct data capture piece has an immediate cost reduction factor of you no longer have to wait for the data to be available, and you don't have to send and pay for the expensive monitors traveling around reviewing the data. But the design of a hybrid study needs to take into account and anticipate a technology platform that is being used to enable that optionality, that flexibility. And your choice of that technology platform could, in fact, reduce the trial cost, improve the data quality. And for example, in the BYOD ePRO example, you're going to have a more engaged patient because if they're using it on their own phone, they're more than likely having that phone accessible and with them as part of their routine daily life. So for example, if you send a text message to their own phone, they're going to get it. Whereas they might not get it if they left their clinical trial phone up on the counter, the bathroom counter, or on their armoire, and they forgot to carry it. And so that's a mechanism to ensure that when that data needs to be captured at the patient's home, they have the phone accessible to them in the first place.
Right. People are more likely to carry their own device as opposed to something they're only used for the clinical trial.
Correct.
So is this why then the FDA and EMA are both encouraging direct data capture practices?
Yeah, the whole regulatory landscape has traditionally been one of the biggest impediments to innovation in the pharmaceutical industry, and particularly in the conduct of clinical trials. But in this case, I'd make a distinction between regulators, the FDA and EMA, and regulatory, employees at pharma companies. The regulators, FDA, EMA, have been very encouraging of adoption of new practices long before even COVID-19. In fact, when the FDA made some of their initial recommendations in the preamble, they said, we want to encourage and promote. Two strong words from a regulatory agency, as opposed to saying this is merely acceptable. They chose to use the words encourage and promote in trying to help the industry adopt more of a direct data capture approach. However, on the flip side, pharma companies themselves, the regulatory groups within pharma, have been dramatically more hesitant They've been extraordinarily creative in coming up with what possibilities could happen if we were to do this, if we were to make this change. And that's been one of the big impediments to really driving some substantial changes that as significant and as devastating as the COVID-19 pandemic has been, it's brought to the surface some of the significant structural dynamics in how clinical trials are executed. And in the recent and immediate pronouncements that the regulatory agencies gave, they reiterated a willingness and openness to explore additional mechanisms and approaches to implementing clinical trials, even if they led to some data discrepancies. Though this is an arena where literally we're in the wild, like activities are happening all around us, and there's going to be some things that work or don't. I think we've all experienced that in our daily life as we've tried to work from home with different settings. And the regulatory agencies are saying, that's okay. It doesn't have to be 100% perfect, but it does need to be done well enough that we can rely on the results. And there's a variety of ways that you can do that. And so even in the recent announcements that they've given over the last couple of weeks, an encouragement of moving to virtual study designs or hybrid trials. And we've actually been working with a number of our customers and even new customers to quickly and rapidly deploy some of these solutions.
So how does bring your own device trials then fit into this brave new world, this new lexicon?
Yeah, so BYOD is on its own an approach that enables patients to more effectively participate in a clinical trial because, as we've alluded to, the accessibility, the availability of the device, the ability to have that with you when you need it. We kind of, at Clinical Inc., we talk about moments that matter. Well, when you're supposed to take your drug, you don't have a reminder there, that's a critical moment that may have passed. And so that having your own device that you trust and use all the time is a really key thing. It also has the effect of simplifying the logistics, reducing the cost, and those are secondary, but they're also important in terms of being able to identify new patients and get them enrolled and what's it going to take and the burden that we place on them. But in this COVID-19 specific environment, we have a perfect case study of some recent experience. So we have an existing customer who's running about 17 studies with us right now, and predominantly based at the site. Well, now they've seen, as I mentioned, that there's been this drop-off in patient participation. How do they help those patients stay participating? They can't just all of a sudden say, let's buy 5,000 phones and deliver them to these patients. You can't even buy through the supply chain that many devices and get them delivered to the right patients. So they've done an assessment, said, we can take out of these routine follow-up visits, we can take a lot of the assessments and allow the patients to fill them out at home. However, they needed a technology to be able to do that. And so they're using our platform to do this as a BYOD approach, basically saying, we'll allow these the patients to download the Clinical Inc. platform, install it on their phone, and then fill out these assessments at home. The site can then call and follow up with the patient about how they're feeling to make sure that things are done appropriately. They can answer any questions. They can expand on any of the data that's been collected. But in a very quick way, without waiting for logistics, without waiting for the supply chain and the ordering and then getting it to the right sites, they can give patients an option to continue to participate in the clinical trial that is, in all likelihood, contributing to their daily life and helping them to feel better. That's one of the motivations in participating in a clinical trial. And so we are in the process of now implementing BYOD study designs for 17 studies to try to, as quickly as possible, give those patients an option to participate.
Right. So you mentioned the 17 of the studies that the Clinical Inc. is involved with. Can you give us some examples for our audience of actual virtual trials that have been successful?
Yeah, in addition, we as a company, we've been the pioneer in this space, and not just from the standpoint of trying to trumpet a small academic endeavor, But we've now done 40 studies across phase 1 through 4 studies that involve BYOD to some extent. We never say that we can do 100% of the patients as bring your own device, because there's always going to be some patients who have like a work phone that's maybe locked down. They're not allowed to download it, or they might have an older device, say 3 or 4 years older. And so there's always a threshold at which we can allow that. But we've done this on 40 studies. And in one particular case, it's a very specific, we did a phase 3 study, 275 patients. It was in dermatology. And what we found is that 90% of the patients were able to use a BYOD phone. And importantly and critically is that the compliance rate, those patients participating in the study, meaning did they answer the questions that they were supposed to? Did they do the things that they were asked to in reviewing the information? We had an overall compliance rate of 98%, which is phenomenal. 100% of people got at least, got all 16 of the particular time points. There was another few that got 15 of the 16 time points. But it was a dramatic increase in the compliance in a phase 3 study, around the country and in 2 Western European countries. And when we looked at that data as well, we found that including things like explanations about why this assessment was being done, or a video about what was going to happen for an upcoming visit to the site, we found that the patients were engaged twice as often and twice as long when it was their own phone relative to the provisioned devices. And that led to this better compliance and better data quality. That's the most recent example that we had. We typically have to do an assessment, and we'll give our customers options that says we think you could get up to 50, 60, 70% BYOD coverage. In this particular case, because it was mostly the United States, it was a very high percentage, 90%.
Yeah.
But that's part of being a little bit more sophisticated about where is this a viable option. And the ultimate benefit is that patients are compliant and the data is available to draw the conclusions from, because that's why ultimately we're running the study, is to understand what's the therapeutic effect of the drug. And if patients aren't compliant, either at home or coming to sites, then there's a need to either deploy a different model, and in many cases a different technology platform that enables them to stay compliant, that we can then draw conclusions from the drug. So that's what we hope is maybe the silver lining that comes out over the next several months and longer term, that there's this flexibility to adopt some new methods and provide some options for patients, while at the same time improving compliance and data quality for conducting clinical trials.
Absolutely. And I think the way that this is changing, I don't think this is going to be temporary, and it would be smart to get on board with this. Well, Ed, thank you so much for taking the time out of your busy schedule to give us the detailed explanation about Clinical Inc. and the important work that your company is involved in.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.